The assassination attempt had been brutal and efficient. Princess Shalara had been attending a diplomatic reception on the neutral station when the explosives had detonated. Her royal guards had shielded her from the worst of the blast, but not enough. Not nearly enough. She collapsed in a corridor lined with frightened onlookers, her iridescent skin darkening with internal hemorrhaging, her breathing shallow and labored. The medical teams had rushed to her only to discover a devastating truth. Shower and physiology required. Specialized equipment that the station's basic medical bay didn't possess. She was dying. That's when Thomas had stepped forward. He was a human environmental technician. Unremarkable, unranked, utterly insignificant in a hierarchy of galactic importance. He'd been in the corridor during the evacuation, and when he'd seen the princess bleeding out on the floor, he'd done what humans did instinctively. He'd responded to suffering. The royal guards had tried to stop him, but Thomas had already knelt beside Shalara, cradling her upper body against his chest. He'd spoken softly, urgently, not to the guards or the medical personnel, but to the dying princess. "I'm here," he'd said. "You're not alone. I'm here." Shalara's eyes had flickered toward him, vast, luminous eyes that held the light of 1,000 stars. She tried to speak, but blood had pooled in her mouth. Thomas had simply held her closer, pressing his forehead gently against hers in a gesture of human compassion that transcended species. And then something impossible had happened. Where Thomas's skin touched Shalara's, the wounds began to close. Not slowly, not gradually. Instantaneously, the lacerations across her shoulder sealed themselves. The internal hemorrhaging reversed. The darkness that had been spreading across her luminescent skin began to recede, light returning to her complexion like dawn breaking across a dark world. The medical personnel had frozen, their instruments unable to process what they were witnessing. The guards had stepped back, their weapons lowering in confusion. Thomas himself seemed unaware of what was occurring, focused entirely on the princess in his arms, speaking softly to her, maintaining contact as though his presence alone could hold her to life. Within moments, Shalara's breathing had stabilized. Her eyes had cleared, focusing on Thomas with wonder and confusion and gratitude so profound. It seemed to transcend language. "Ow," she'd whispered, her voice like crystalline bells. Thomas had looked at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I don't know." The royal physicians had descended with instruments and authority, demanding to examine both Thomas and the princess. Every test they conducted had yielded the same bewildering result. Thomas possessed a unique biochemical signature, dormant in his genetic code, likely inherited from a distant ancestor who'd encountered Shalara in physiology generations ago. He was a natural healer. His touch didn't just close wounds. It accelerated cellular regeneration, harmonized damage systems, and somehow communicated at a biological level with Shalara physiology in ways modern medicine couldn't replicate. The royal scientists had theorized it might work with other species, but Shalara's case was the first documented instance. Thomas had become suddenly impossibly important. The emperor had demanded his presence at court. Scientists wanted to study him. Military strategists saw him as a weapon, a healer who could preserve soldiers, commanders, royalty. Everyone wanted something from the humble environmental technician. But Shalara had done something unexpected. She'd refused to allow anyone else to examine Thomas without his consent. She'd established him not as a specimen or a resource, but as an honored guest of the royal family. And more than that, she'd begun spending time with him. They'd walk through the palace gardens together, and Thomas would tell her about Earth, about rain and forests, and the simple human capacity to feel empathy for suffering. Shalara would listen with wonder, asking questions that revealed how different her upbringing had been, how isolated royalty made her. One evening, as they'd sat beneath bioluminescent flowers that mirrored her own luminescence, Shalara had taken his hand. "You saved my life," she'd said simply. "Not with some miraculous power, with your presence, with your refusal to let me be alone while dying." "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas had protested. "No," Shalara had replied, her fingers interlacing with his. "They wouldn't. Most beings see suffering and calculate the risk-benefit analysis. They weigh duty against danger. But humans, you see suffering and you simply respond. There's no hesitation, no cost-benefit equation, just compassion." She'd leaned closer, her luminescence brightening where it touched his skin. "My people have vast technology, incredible power, weapons that could level worlds. But we'd lost the ability to simply hold someone who's dying and tell them they're not alone. You reminded me why that matters more than anything else we possess." Thomas had realized in that moment that his healing gift wasn't something he possessed alone. It lived in every human, the ability to see suffering, and respond without calculation, to offer presence when presence was all that could save someone. And that perhaps was the greatest power in the universe.